process, and you really don't need to know what's happening. But if your computer doesn't start or displays error during startup, a thorough understanding of the startup process helps you quickly identify the possible problems and the necessary actions to take to get things running again. In this video, we'll look at the Windows boot process in considerable detail. As we go through the process, instead of focusing on each detail, try to gain an overall understanding of the process. As you work with computers, you'll eventually remember more and more of the details. It's helpful to divide the startup process into the following general stages. The first stage is the post or power on self-test, and this deals mainly with verifying the hardware and initializing the computer. The second stage is the bootloader stage. This is the stage where the computer looks for and identifies the location of the operating system files. The bootloader is kind of an intermediary between the post process and the operating system process that helps the computer identify where the operating system exists. The third step is the operating system load process. During this process, the operating system loads system files. It loads critical drivers, and it loads portions of the registry. And the fourth stage is logon or user configuration. This involves loading the user profile, along with additional drivers and other settings. With these four basic stages in mind, let's look at each stage in more detail. During the post process, the following components are involved. You need to get power to the computer. There needs to be a processor. The processor looks for code in the BIOS, and it loads the code that runs the startup process. The processor requires memory in order to save the code and any information that it needs as it's working. And it also requires a video display to show information on the screen. So when you turn the computer on, the processor is initialized. It is hard-coded to look at a specific address for a program to run. And that program then points it to the BIOS so that it can load the BIOS program. The BIOS program includes routines that detect and initialize hardware. In addition to this minimum hardware that's required, other hardware is also detected and configured. During this stage, the BIOS uses the settings in the CMOS memory to configure the hardware that's in the computer. It also uses plug and play to detect and assign resources to hardware. The last stage of this process, or the first stage of the next process, is to look in the CMOS settings to identify the boot device order. Or in other words, the order that it should search devices to find the operating system and other files that it needs. If the bootloader stage is successful, the bootloader program will be running. The bootloader program then has a list of operating systems that it can start. And the next step is to pass control of the computer over to the operating system. Instead of the BIOS loading the operating system directly, it instead passes control over to a program called the bootloader. And the bootloader's job is to locate and load the operating system. During the bootloader phase, the BIOS locates the bootloader code and executes it. So one of the first things it uses is the boot order that's specified in the CMOS settings. So for example, let's say I have a floppy drive, a DVD drive, I have disk 1, and I have disk 2. And this is the order that I'm specified to search for the operating system. Now let's say that the BIOS first goes to the floppy disk and does not find a disk in the drive. Because there is no disk, it skips the floppy disk and searches the next device in the order, in this case the DVD drive. If there is no disk in the DVD drive, then it will go to the next device in the list. Now let's say that there is a hard drive in my computer. The next step is for the BIOS program to look in the master boot record. The master boot record is the first sector on the disk. if I have a hard disk, and perhaps I have 3 partitions on that disk, the master boot record is the first sector on that disk. The job of the master boot record is to keep track of the partitions on the disk, and as well to identify the active partition. The active partition is the partition that would hold the bootloader code. So the BIOS, when it checks the disk, looks in the master boot record. The master boot record identifies this partition as active. The BIOS program then goes to what's called the volume boot record, which is the first sector on the volume. Within this first sector, it looks for the location of the bootloader code. The bootloader code itself is not located within the first sector, but simply the first sector points to the actual location of the bootloader code within the partition. For Windows XP and earlier, the bootloader program is called NTLDR, or in other words, NTLoader. For Windows Vista and higher, the bootloader program is called Boot MGR, or Boot Manager. Once the BIOS has located the location for the bootloader code, it executes the bootloader program and passes control of the computer over to the bootloader program. Next, with the bootloader running, it needs to identify the location of the operating system files. The program itself maintains a database that identifies available operating systems on the computer. For NTLoader, this file is the boot.ini file. So when NTLoader executes, it